They heard the explosion before they saw the fire. It rolled across the harbor like thunder trapped in iron sheds, rattling window panes, shaking soot from rafters, and making the black water of the Baltic jump in concentric rings. In the command post above the shipyard, Kapitänleutnant Otto Brandt straightened from the chart table, pen frozen in his fingers, as a deep orange flash lit the night through the rain-smeared window. For half a second, the cranes, gantries, and half-finished hulls below were etched in hard silhouette. Then darkness swallowed them again, followed by a second, sharper blast that sent a thin cascade of plaster dust drifting from the ceiling. Someone knocked over a chair, someone else swore in German, and the duty NCO fumbled with the light switches, flooding the room in a harsh white glare that felt suddenly useless in the face of what was happening outside. They crowded to the windows, boots thudding on the floorboards, shoulder to shoulder as another bloom of fire punched up behind the covered slipway. This one brighter, angrier. Sirens woke with a mechanical howl. Air raid klaxons that had stayed mercifully silent for months now, suddenly competing with the rumble of collapsing girders and the popping of ammunition cooking off in some forgotten crate. Otto yanked open the window and cold, salty air rushed in, carrying the heavy, oily smell of burning fuel and scorched paint. Below, men were running like small black insects across the yard, their flashlights cutting nervous arcs through the dark as a column of flame climbed skyward, feeding on something big and metallic. Against that inferno, far out near the breakwater, he saw it, a small, low silhouette moving away from the harbor mouth, barely a notch against the glinting cat's eye of distant waves. Fishing boat, someone muttered beside him, disgust rather than alarm in the word. Who in God's name is fishing at this hour? Otto's jaw clenched. In Berlin, they'd warned them about sabotage, about communists and British agents and traitors in clean Danish clothes. They'd taught them to count railroad tracks and storage depots, to double-lock fuel tanks, and check workers' passes twice. But as another explosion ripped open the night in a shower of sparks and screaming steel, he realized with a sick, cold clarity that nobody had ever told them to be afraid of fishing boats. Later, buried in reports and acronyms and phrases like probable enemy demolition charges, they would call it an incident. They would put numbers to the damage. So many tons of steel lost. So many weeks of repair capacity wiped out. Such and such percentage impact on the fleet. They would underline saboteurs, emphasize the need for cordons and curfews, mention Bolshevik elements with the neat, tight handwriting of men who had not been there when the sky turned orange. But the truth, the story that lived in the smell of burnt timber and hot metal long after the fires went out, began somewhere else entirely, in the places those officers had trained themselves not to look. It began where the light of the shipyard did not quite reach, among low roofs and salt-stiff nets, and men whose names never made it into the reports. It began on the water, where the fishing boats moved. For 3 years, the German occupation had sat over Denmark like a gray coat that nobody dared to shrug off, heavy but carefully brushed. In April 1940, the invasion had come quickly and politely brutal. A few hours of fighting, a handful of dead, then the government's decision to capitulate and cooperate to spare the country ruin. Compared to Poland, to Norway, to the black hole that was the Eastern Front, Denmark looked almost peaceful on the maps in Berlin. Trains ran. The king still rode his horse through Copenhagen. Officially, there was no war here anymore, only an arrangement. And in offices like Otto Brandt's, the phrase model protectorate appeared often in memoranda and briefings, always with a faint undertone of condescension. They liked to say the Danes were pragmatic people who knew when they were beaten. They liked to say this out loud, in clubs and messes, over schnapps and beer, when someone asked whether they were bored on such a quiet posting. "They're fishermen and farmers," one Oberstleutnant had remarked at a reception, swirling cognac, his chest heavy with medals from France. "Not exactly Spartans. They deliver bacon, butter, and fish. We repair ships. Everyone is happy." There was laughter, the easy laughter of men who believed they had measured the world and found it smaller than their guns. On the quays of small towns dotted along the Danish coast, men like Erik Madsen heard that laughter echoing in stricter forms, in curfews nailed up on municipal boards, in boots on cobblestones, in the barked protests of sentries if a net was hauled in too close to a restricted pier. Erik was a fisherman like his father and grandfather before him, broad-shouldered and windburned, his blonde hair already touched with gray at the temples, though he was barely past 30. He had been a sailor once too, during a brief, uneventful stint in the small Danish navy, where he'd learned navigation, signal flags, and the particular arrogance of officers who had never ridden out a winter storm. He'd been ashore, back in his village, when the Germans came, watching from the harbor wall as planes droned overhead, and angry plumes of smoke rose in the distance. He remembered thinking, with a dull, stunned fury, that no one had even asked him to fight. In the months that followed, Occupation seeped into his life the way the Baltic seeped into old timber, gradually, insistently, leaving a taste of salt and rot. German patrol boats occasionally nosed into the harbor, gray and sharp against the softer curves of local craft, their engines too loud, their crew too young and sure of themselves. Officers with polished boots and stiff leather gloves walked the quay, counting hulls, glancing at papers, asking questions in impatient German that the mayor translated in careful Danish. At first, they only wanted to make sure that catches were declared, that fuel usage was recorded, that no one was being unhelpful. They were polite enough, in that chilly way that said politeness was a choice, not a habit. What they did not want, what they could not bother to imagine, was that the men in worn sweaters and rubber boots might be anything but what they appeared. It started, as these things often did, with whispers that moved faster than any official directive. A cousin in Copenhagen who said students were distributing leaflets. A railway worker in Odense whose brother knew a man in a group that painted V symbols on walls at night. A rumor that the British were dropping agents into the countryside, that someone on the coast had seen parachutes, pale flowers opening in the dark. For months, it was all half-heard stories traded over mugs of black coffee in kitchens that smelled of fish and boiled potatoes, quickly cut off when children entered the room. Then, one evening in the winter of 1942, a stranger walked into the back room of the small tavern near the harbor where Eric sometimes played cards. He had the look of a man who had spent too long trying not to be noticed, clothes that were too ordinary, haircut in a style that did not commit to any trade, a face that could blend into a crowd. But there was a sharpness in his eyes, a tension in the way he held his shoulders as if the air around him were slightly electrified. He introduced himself simply as Johann, buying a round of beer and nodding to the innkeeper with the easy confidence of someone who had already paid for his welcome in another currency. When he finally spoke to Eric, leaning close over the cracked wooden table, his voice was low but steady. "You know the channels out there," he said, tilting his head toward the black window, where the sea was nothing but a sound. "You know where the shoals are, where the patrols are lazy. We need men like you." Eric's fingers tightened around his glass. For a second he saw his wife, Anna, her hands white with soap as she scrubbed their children's clothes, the way she smiled tightly when she heard boots in the street. He saw the small house they'd managed to keep, the boat that was both their livelihood and their debt. Then he thought of the confiscated radios, the food going south, the look on the local policeman's face every time he had to accompany a German patrol to some neighbor's door. "What for?" he asked, though he already knew. "Outside, somewhere," a gull cried once, sharp and lonely. "Because they don't look at you," Johann said softly. "Because when they see your boat, they see fish, and anything they don't look at can move freely." Johann was not just some stranger. In another life, he had been a school teacher in Aarhus, more comfortable with chalk in his hands than dynamite. War had turned him into something else, a node in a growing web of resistance groups, connected by radio waves and coded letters, tied loosely to London and to each other. He had come that night because someone in Copenhagen had passed along a name, Madsen, knows the sea, hates them. At first, what he asked for seemed almost simple, almost harmless. Could Eric, on his next trip out, keep an eye on the horizon at a certain hour, a certain night? Could he memorize whether a particular patrol boat lingered near the Western Channel or cut across it? Could he note if the light on the distant buoy, long rumored to be part of some German navigational network, blinked in a new pattern? Information, that was all. Nothing dangerous, Johann promised with a thin smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Just a fisherman noticing the sea. But information, like the first crack in ice, has a way of widening. The British, watching through their own slit windows in London war rooms, understood the map of Northern Europe in terms of tonnage and turnaround. Kriegsmarine ships damaged in the Arctic convoys limped back to be repaired at places like Trondheim, Kiel, and the Danish yards that lined the sheltered inlets of the Belt and the Sound. Each dock, each crane, each dry dock berth that could accept a destroyer or a U-boat was a node in a logistical chain that kept the gray wolves hunting. Bombers could reach some of these targets. Others were too well defended, too far, too wrapped in civilian neighborhoods that made firebombing a kind of massacre. But a man in Copenhagen had sent a message through Stockholm, and that message had traversed cables and ciphers until it lay on a desk in London. "We have fishermen, we have harbors, we have courage. What we lack is explosives." When the first shipment came, it did not look like anything special. A sealed crate delivered to the back of a cooperative dairy, rolled through a yard that smelled of hay and cows, shifted from wagon to wagon until a farmer with a tired horse and an older truck drove it, slowly, as if it were nothing but milk cans, toward the coast. Inside the crate, wrapped in waxed paper and cotton, were blocks of plastic explosive and a handful of timers. British-made tools whose weight seemed far heavier than the few kilos they actually represented. Johann gathered a small group in a shed that smelled of tar and old rope. There was Eric, his hands still rough from hauling nets, There was Karl, a dock worker whose brother had disappeared into a German prison the previous year. There was a mechanic named Soren who knew engines the way a priest knows scripture. The lamp on the workbench threw their faces into hard relief as Johann unwrapped one of the explosives and placed it gently on the table. For a moment, nobody spoke. "This is not for heroics," Johann said finally. "We are not going to blow up tanks in the main street at noon. That's for the movies the Germans will make after the war to show how dangerous we were." A few tight smiles flickered and died. "We are going to be patient and precise. We will make every kilogram count. When we move, we will already know how the Germans will react. And when they finally look for us, we will be back at sea, smelling of fish and diesel." He gestured to a crude map tacked to the wall, lines and circles scribbled over a printed chart of the harbor and its approaches. "Here," he said, tapping the main shipyard. "They think this is safe. They think the only way to attack it is from the air, and they have guns for that. They forget the water itself is a road. They forget you." The problem, when they looked at it clearly, seemed almost insoluble. The shipyard sat behind fences, behind guard posts and patrol routes, hugged by warehouses where German guards smoked and cracked jokes in hard, metallic German that carried easily through the cold night air. Spotlights swept the land approaches. Sentries checked workers' papers as they came and went. Even if someone got in with explosives, getting out again would be nearly impossible. To simply walk up to those gates with a bomb in a satchel would be suicide. And yet the need was clear. Ships went in damaged and came out whole. Every hull that slid back into the water cost Allied sailors lives on distant seas. They stared at the map until their eyes blurred. They walked the perimeter by day, pretending to admire new cranes or to seek work, feeling the weight of eyes on their backs, counting seconds between patrols. At night, from the deck of Eric's boat, they watched the yard lights glow like a false sunrise against the clouds. Sometimes, the frustration knotted in Eric's chest until he felt he might choke on it. Then one evening, when the sky was the flat, leaden color that promised rain, Anna solved what they could not. She did not mean to. She was simply clearing the table, stacking plates that still smelled faintly of fried herring, listening with half an ear as Eric and Karl muttered over their folded map. She knew enough not to ask for details. The less she knew, the less she could betray, even under the worst pressure. Yet she also knew her husband's face, the way worry sat heavy on his brow. "So you need to get close enough to touch it," she said, drying her hands on a towel. "But you can't be seen walking toward it. That's the idea," Karl said, glancing up at her with a lopsided smile. "Unless you think we might tunnel from here." She snorted softly, moving to wipe a smear of oil from the table. "If I were them," she mused, "I would watch the road, the workers, the trucks. I'd watch the train yard, but I wouldn't waste my time counting every stupid little boat coming and going. They stink, they're noisy, and they all look the same." She paused, realizing both men had gone very still. "What?" Eric's heart gave a little jolt, as sudden and clear as a fish striking a line. He saw, in a flash, the harbor as the Germans must see it, a place of schedules and passes and gates, where everything that moved on land could be penned, watched, documented. And then he saw it as he had always seen it, a place where the real traffic was not on the streets but on the water, where boats went in and out at all hours, where the tide set its own rhythm that no man could command. The shipyard's piers jutted into that same water, drawing their strength from its buoyancy. "The fish unloading dock," he said slowly. "On the east side, it backs onto the outer fence of the yard." He looked at Karl, remembering. "We used to sell there before the war. They still take deliveries, don't they?" Karl nodded, eyes widening. "The canteen, for the workers, cheap protein." Johann, when they told him, did not smile. He had long since learned that ideas alone did not win wars. But he listened, head bowed as they sketched it out. A boat loaded with genuine fish and one hidden cargo, a delivery scheduled just before dawn, when men were tired and dark still clung to the corners. A section of fence that backed onto stacked crates and coils of cable, only a few meters of no man's land between. The danger was immense, the elegance too. "We'll have to test them," Soren muttered, gesturing to the explosives. "See how they react to the salt air, the cold. Timers have to work in the wet." "So we test," Eric said, hearing his own heartbeat drum in his ears. "Out there, where no one is looking." The first test was nothing more than a small charge, wrapped carefully in tarred canvas and nestled in the gap between two rocks near a deserted cove. They rowed out in a dinghy under a moon thin as a thumbnail, their breath steaming in the air, the water black and thick beneath them. The timer ticked softly in Johann's pocket, like an artificial second heart. When the explosion came, muffled and dull, it sent only a modest plume of water and shattered stone into the air, but they watched the shockwave ripple out with almost reverent eyes. They measured the crater the next day, fingers tracing broken rock. They adjusted the wrapping, the amount, the positioning. It felt, Eric thought, not unlike learning to fish again, understanding how the invisible currents moved, how much weight a line could take, recognizing when to tug and when to let the sea do the work. Word of their experiments carried in cautious coded phrases to London. There, an officer in the Special Operations Executive leaned back in his chair and stared at the map of Denmark on the wall, at the pins stuck through the coastal town they named only by a number in their files. "If they can hurt shipyard capacity even by 10%, he said, tapping ash into a tray, "that's fewer U-boats repaired before the next convoy. We can give them more timers, more explosives. The question is whether they can survive the first success long enough to make a second attempt." In occupied Denmark, survival was always the unspoken condition. The Germans, for their part, remained serenely confident. Reports from the harbor master about minor unusual activity were noted, underlined once, and filed. A sentry who mentioned that some fishermen seemed to linger near the restricted breakwater at odd hours earned a reprimand for abandoning his post to stare at waves. At a small gathering in the officers' mess one evening, a visiting rear admiral from Kiel chuckled over his schnapps. "Sabotage from the sea?" he scoffed. "Let the British write about that in their novels. We have patrol boats, mines, radar. The only things moving under our noses are cod and herring. And Danish fishermen," someone added, to general laughter. By the time they stopped laughing, it was already too late. The night they chose for the first real strike felt, on the surface, remarkably ordinary. A low mist clung to the harbor, muting colors and sounds. The air smelled of tar, fish, and coal smoke. Somewhere a dog barked once, then thought better of it. At the quay, under the jaundiced glare of a single lamp, Eric moved with practiced slowness, his hands going through the familiar motions of checking lines and nets, cursing softly as if at tangles that did not exist. Beneath the planks under his boots, hidden in a false compartment that Soren had built with reverent care, rested 2 charges wrapped in oilcloth, their timers silent for now. Anna stood on the pier with their youngest child on her hip, the boy half asleep, his head lolling against her shoulder. She knew better than to ask what was different about this trip. The way Eric had checked the door twice before they left, the way he had hugged each child separately, already told her more than she wanted to know. She reached out and touched his arm as he stepped into the boat. "Come back with fish," she said, the old, habitual phrase suddenly heavy with layers of meaning. "I always do," he replied, then softer, so only she could hear. "If anyone asks, we had a bad catch. Hardly worth the fuel." She nodded once. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue already. The boat slipped away from the pier with the easy familiarity of years, its small engine coughing to life and settling into a low, steady thrum. The mist swallowed the shore in seconds, turning the world into a bubble of gray around them. Carl sat hunched near the bow, staring ahead, knuckles white on the rail. Johann, in a plain fisherman's cap and borrowed coat, tried to look like a man who had done this all his life and not someone whose hands still bore faint traces of chalk from old blackboards. They did, in fact, fish. That was part of the camouflage and part of the superstition. To go out and not cast the nets would have felt like tempting more than just German suspicion. They let the weights drag their mesh belly through the dark water, feeling the pulls and jerks, hearing the muted rattle of the winch, smelling the metallic tang of the catch when it came up flapping and silver. They worked by lantern light, their movements automatic, almost comforting. Beneath the fresh fish, in the hold, they arranged crates that were not entirely what they seemed. As they turned toward the harbor again, the eastern sky held the faintest promise of pale light, but night still ruled. The shipyard's lights made a low glowing dome on the horizon, a false dawn humming with electricity and war work. Through his binoculars, from a post on the breakwater, a German sentry saw only what he expected to see: a small fishing boat returning, low in the water with its catch, its engine note familiar, its wake modest. He watched it for a moment, shivering in the damp, then turned away to stamp his feet and think about his breakfast. At the fish unloading dock, 2 Danish workers in stained aprons waited sleepily, hands jammed into their pockets. They had been warned subtly that something unusual might happen tonight, but not what. In occupation, it was often safer not to know details. Complicity lived more comfortably in vagueness. Still, they unlocked the gate with fingers that trembled imperceptibly and kept their eyes on the boards as the boat bumped gently against the fenders. Eric threw a rope up to them, his voice casual. "Bad night," he grunted in Danish. "Small catch. Sea's sulking. Sea or someone else?" one of the workers murmured, not looking at him. The bolt slid back on the gate with a sound that seemed, suddenly, very loud. The German guard assigned to the unloading point was bored, which meant he was dangerous in the particular way of men who half doze through duties they contemptuously consider beneath them. He leaned in the doorway of a small shack, rifle slung, cap tilted back, eyes flicking only occasionally toward the activity at the dock. Fishing deliveries were low priority. His attention was on his cigarette and the thought of the girl he had left in Bremen, who wrote less often now. He did not notice the moment when one of the crates on the cart took a little longer to settle than the others, when Carl's hand lingered just a fraction of a second as he adjusted its position near the sagging outer fence. He did not see Johann's quick, precise movement near the crate's corner, the brief contact that completed what they had so carefully prepared. He did not hear the soft tick begin, hidden under the heavier creaks and clanks of the dock. Within 15 minutes, the boat was leaving again, lighter now, its hold emptier, its crew moving with forced nonchalance. The sky had paled to a dirty blue. Somewhere, a gull wheeled and screamed, its cry cutting through the hum of the waking harbor. Eric kept his eyes on the channel markers, on the lazy bobbing of buoys, on anything but the receding outline of the shipyard, where men in overalls were already filing toward the gates carrying lunch tins, ignorant of the small, silent enemy sitting near a sagging stretch of fence. He did not see the explosion itself. They were around the bend of the breakwater by then, the shipyard hidden from view by the curve of land. But they felt it. The shock ran through the water and into the hull like a giant fist, making the boards shudder under their feet. A deep, flat boom rolled over them, followed a moment later by a sharper crackle, like ripping metal. Eric looked back in spite of himself and saw the sky above the shipyard bloom briefly orange, then darker as smoke began to rise. On the quay near the fish dock, the German guard's cigarette fell from his lips as the ground under him jerked. For a moment he thought of a boiler explosion. Then he heard the unmistakable roar of igniting fuel and the shouts, high in alarm, in both German and Danish. The section of fence near the crates bulged outward, twisted by the blast. Beyond it, a storage shed that housed paint and solvents had become a torch, sending greasy black smoke up in choking waves. The guard grabbed his rifle and ran toward the chaos, not yet understanding that the fire was not the problem but the signal, because in chaos, men made mistakes. They left doors open, they turned their backs, they forgot to ask for papers. The first attack did not cripple the shipyard. It took out a warehouse, damaged some electrical lines, cost the Germans a handful of workers and some equipment. Within days, repair crews were hammering and welding, replacing what had been lost. For the officers who filed the reports, it was an annoyance, a sharp slap to pride, but not a mortal wound. They promised stricter inspections of all deliveries. They made noise about saboteurs. They increased patrol frequency. They did not, however, reconsider their fundamental assumption that the fishing boats themselves were not the enemy. Inspections tightened. Boats returning to harbor were occasionally stopped, boarded, and searched by men who frowned at crates of fish and poked half-heartedly at nets. Papers were examined more carefully. Questions were asked with a little more bite, but there were limits to how thorough they could be. Fish spoiled. Harbors had to function. There were German soldiers who liked fresh fish too. The resistance adapted. They changed delivery times, routes, the harbors they used. They paid more attention to who was on duty at which gate, to which German guards had girlfriends in town, and were therefore more distracted toward the end of their shifts. They varied the crates, sometimes carrying nothing but fish, sometimes delivering small, almost symbolic charges that did more psychological damage than structural. A fuse in a power junction here, a delayed action device in a tool shed there, small bites, calculated to add up. With each success, the risk grew. The occupation authorities in Copenhagen growled for results. The Gestapo, whose presence had been faint before, took a keener interest in the coastal regions. Men in leather coats began appearing in cafes, asking careful questions in even more careful Danish. Names circulated on whispered lists of those to avoid, those who had suddenly become too curious or too talkative. One night, a fisherman from a neighboring village did not come home. The next morning, someone found his cap in the gutter near the German garrison, trampled and wet. Eric felt the noose tightening, even as the operations became more ambitious. The second major strike used not one boat, but three, moving like ghosts through a fog so thick it seemed solid. Their targets were fuel tanks this time, squat shadows crouched near the docks, filled with the lifeblood of ships and vehicles. The charges, planted with grim efficiency during a fake mechanical breakdown that forced them to drift near the restricted pier, turned the tanks into pillars of fire that lit the town's roofs with an eerie, flickering glow. From Anna's kitchen window, holding a trembling mug between her cold hands, she watched the flames and tried not to imagine her husband's face lit by that same infernal light. For Otto Brandt and his fellow officers, the pattern was beginning to sting. Shipyard productivity reports showed delays, damaged equipment, lost man-hours. Correspondence from higher command grew sharper. "You told us Denmark was quiet," one admiral wrote, his fury barely contained beneath the stiff formality. "From here it sounds as if the Danes are louder than the British." In meetings, pointing at charts, Otto spoke of communist agitators, of British influence, of enemy intelligence. He advocated for more fences, more searches, more dogs. He spoke of controlling the land approaches and securing key infrastructure. When one junior officer timidly mentioned the possibility of inspecting fishing vessels more rigorously, he dismissed it with a wave. "We cannot treat every fisherman as an enemy," he said curtly. "They're too many. We need their catches. And frankly, they lack the courage and organization for this scale of sabotage. No, this is the work of trained agents, foreigners." The word hung in the air with a faint, contemptuous clang. Foreigners. In his mind, fishermen remained what they had always been. Background figures in paintings of sunsets, silhouettes on postcards, men who smelled of guts and brine, not people who could change the course of a war. The arrogance was not his alone. It was structural, woven into the way an occupying power saw the occupied. It was in the way German soldiers joked about herring eaters, in the way they spoke of "our Danes" as if the population were a herd. It was in the fact that while every factory worker near the shipyards had a file, few officers could name the man who delivered fish to the canteen. The resistance had no such blind spots. Every name, every routine mattered. They knew when a particular guard's mother in Germany was ill, because his mood changed and he drank more. They knew which night a certain patrol boat always refueled and left a gap in the harbor approaches. They knew which pier planks squeaked and which crates could be moved without attracting attention. They knew, in short, the texture of the harbor in a way no outsider ever could. By the summer of 1943, the war's echo had grown louder even here. News, distorted, fragmentary, hopeful, filtered through about German setbacks in Russia, about defeats in North Africa, about bombers over Hamburg. In the streets of Copenhagen and in factories across the country, strikes and protests began to flare, brief but fierce, signaling that the uneasy cooperation of the early occupation was cracking. The Germans responded with curfews, shootings, arrests. The model protectorate's mask was slipping, revealing teeth beneath. In that tense atmosphere, London asked for something bigger. A message, encoded and transmitted through invisible waves, arrived in Johann's hands via a dangerous chain of couriers. It spoke, with the cold detachment of staff officers, of a particular ship scheduled to enter the Danish yard for repairs, a small but critical cog in the machinery of war, a vessel whose absence from the Atlantic for a few extra weeks might save dozens of Allied lives. If they could disrupt the yard's capacity at the right moment, the impact would ripple far beyond their small harbor. Johann read the message twice, then looked up at Eric, Karl, and the others gathered in the shed. The lamp threw their shadows large on the timber wall behind them. "They're asking for a firestorm," he said quietly, "not pinpricks. They want the yard in chaos for days. That means hitting not just one thing, but several. Equipment, fuel, power lines. They want us to bite as hard as we can." Karl whistled softly between his teeth. "They do realize we are 6 men in one boat?" he muttered. "6 men," Anna said from the doorway, her voice startling them. She had come to bring coffee and bread, thin and hard-edged with wartime substitutions, but she did not step further inside. 6 men, and every wife and mother who lies for them. "Don't forget us." There was silence for a moment. Then Eric folded the message carefully and slid it into his pocket, feeling the weight of it as if it were lead. "We'll need more than one boat," he said, "and we'll need the tide." The plan that emerged over the next days was as intricate as any naval operation planned in a grand staff room, but it smelled of tar and fish instead of pipe smoke and polish. 3 boats would be involved, Eric's and 2 others, whose captains had, over months, edged from quiet sympathy into active collaboration. One would carry the main charges, destined for transformers and switchgear that fed power to the yard. Another would focus on fuel storage, small tanks clustered near maintenance sheds. The third would serve as lookout and backup, ready to create a diversion if anything went wrong. They pored over a stolen copy of the yard's layout, counting steps between landmarks, measuring distances in the kind of detail only men used to reading the sea could achieve. They walked along public paths at the yard's perimeter, breathing in coal dust and hot metal, pretending to admire the ships while their eyes followed cables and pipes. They watched workers' shifts change, noting when the gates were busiest and when they were almost deserted. They traced the routines of the German guards, those human cogs in the machine who, like all men, grew lax when boredom and fatigue wore at them. Timing would be everything. The charges had to go off within minutes of each other to maximize chaos. Too staggered, and the Germans could move swiftly to contain damage. Too early, and they might merely frighten, not cripple. Too late, and workers might already be gone, reducing disruption, but also losing the psychological impact of seeing their invincible yard in flames. The night chosen for the operation arrived damp and windless, the air heavy as if waiting for a storm that refused to break. The harbor smelled of seaweed and coal smoke. In the distance, faintly, the shipyard lights glowed, haloed by moisture. From certain vantage points on the water, the yard looked almost beautiful, cranes standing like skeletal sentinels against the blurred stars. Eric's boat slid slid out first, its engine a low murmur under the creak of wooden hull against water. The other two followed at carefully calculated intervals, so that to any watcher on shore, they would appear simply as a staggered line of late-returning fishermen. On the decks, men moved with the same measured, unhurried gestures that had carried them through countless ordinary nights. Inside, beneath coats and hats and behind calm faces, hearts beat hard enough to be felt in throats. At the Shipyards fish dock, the same sullen German guard from previous deliveries checked his watch and cursed the damp that seeped into his boots. He had been warned, in a perfunctory briefing, that saboteurs were active in the region, that he should be vigilant. The warning sat in his mind alongside many others. Watch for parachutists, watch for strangers on trains, watch for suspicious packages. The effect of so many orders was to dull them all. A fisherman's boat, low in the water and smelling of catch, did not light up any of those mental warning flares. It simply smelled, as always, of work. The first boat tied up, exchanged muttered greetings with the dock workers, and eased its crates onto handcarts. The second boat, under cover of the slight congestion this caused, slipped a little further down the pier, closer to a section of fence that lay in shadow, half forgotten behind coils of grimy rope and rusting barrels. There, in the half-light, hands moved deftly, positioning packages where they would do the most good. Each movement was rehearsed, each touch of finger to timer, each glance at a watch synchronized days before. Yet reality has a way of rewriting even the best-laid plans. As Carl turned to adjust the final crate, his elbow tapped a loose plank. It clattered onto the boards with a noise that, to his keyed-up senses, sounded as loud as a rifle shot. The German guard's head snapped around. "Hey!" he barked, stepping forward, hand moving toward his rifle. Time slowed. Johann, standing closest to the guard, saw the man's eyes narrow, saw suspicion spring to life where boredom had been. He did something then that he would remember in jagged flashes for the rest of his life. He smiled and stumbled deliberately, sending a crate of genuine fish teetering toward the edge of the dock. With a colorful curse in Danish, he lunged to catch it, arms flailing theatrically. The guard's instinct kicked in. The instinct not of a saboteur, but of a man who had carried boxes and crates his whole life when not in uniform. He stepped forward quickly, grabbing the other side of the crate to steady it. For a second, his hands locked with Johann's, their faces inches apart, one smelling of tobacco, the other of fear masked by salt and sweat. "Careful," the guard muttered in accented Danish. "You'll waste your own pay." Johann let out a breath that could have been a nervous laugh, nodding gratefully. Behind them, in the shadows, the crucial crate was already in place. The guard, satisfied, stepped back, his annoyance diffused into ordinary workplace irritation. Minutes later, as the boats eased away from the dock and drifted toward the harbor mouth, small mechanical hearts were ticking in the dark. One nestled near the base of a transformer, another under a fuel pipe, another in a tool shed filled with oily rags and solvents. The tide, slow but inexorable, began to turn, carrying the fishermen outward, away from the scene they had set. On the breakwater, a different sentry than months before watched the departing boats with a gaze that held, perhaps, a sliver more suspicion now. Twice in recent months, explosions had followed such departures. He had mentioned this to his corporal, who had shrugged and told him not to see phantoms in every shadow. Still, he stared a little longer, watching the wake spread. "Damn fishermen," he muttered, rubbing his cold hands together. Always at odd hours. They should set proper times. Behind him, in the yard, a worker flipped a switch that sent power surging through cables. In a small metal box near the base of a transformer, a timer's last spring unwound with a sound no human ear could hear. The first blast was not the largest, but it was the most important. It erupted from the heart of the yard's power system, a compact detonation that shattered ceramic insulators and twisted copper bus bars into snarled wreckage. Light flickered across the yard, then went out in a wave, plunging workshops and sheds into sudden darkness. There were shouts, the scrape of boots, the metallic ring of dropped tools. For 3 long heartbeats, the shipyard held its breath. Then the second explosion hit the fuel line, and the world tilted. Fire is a language all its own, and tonight it spoke in a rapid, climbing cadence. Fuel sprayed like liquid wind for a fraction of a second before igniting, turning air into a wall of heat that blasted outward, shoving men to the ground, peeling paint from metal. Windows imploded, spraying glass across concrete. A crane operator, sitting idle in his cabin during a break, felt the whole structure shudder and clung to his seat as the skyline outside lit up in a terrifying orange. The third detonation, slightly delayed by design, tore through a tool and equipment shed, sending nails, splinters, and shards of metal pinwheeling into the dark. Combined, the blast created not just physical destruction, but confusion. Alarms failed because their circuits had been cut. Backup lights flickered uselessly. Radio calls crackled through damaged lines. For crucial minutes, nobody was quite sure what had happened or where to go. From the water, the fishermen saw only the outer signs: the sudden bloom of fire behind the yard's silhouette, the rise of a thick black plume against the low clouds, the stuttering flashes that marked smaller secondary explosions as tanks, barrels, and machines surrendered to heat. The sound came a moment later, rolling over the harbor like distant thunder layered on thunder, a chorus of man-made disaster. Eric's hands tightened on the wheel until his knuckles hurt. Behind him, Carl let out a low whistle that was equal parts awe and dread. "We did that," he said quietly, as if afraid the sea itself might overhear. "God help us. We actually did that." "Shut up and watch the channel marker," Eric replied through clenched teeth, though he felt the same mix of emotions knotting his stomach. Pride, terror, relief, grief for the unknown dead and injured, cold hatred for the system that had made such acts necessary. On land, Otto Brandt was jerked from a half-sleep in his office chair by the blast's concussion. For a few precious seconds he was a boy again, in a thunderstorm on the North Sea. The world outside his window, nothing but sheets of rain and flashes of white. Then reality slammed in. The smell of burning fuel, the shouts, the sudden darkness, as emergency lights failed to come on. He stumbled to the window in time to see a column of fire roaring up from the yard, painting the low clouds lurid red. "Sabotage," he whispered, the word tasting like ashes. Again. But this time there was no dismissing it as minor, no belittling it in reports. By the time the fires were brought under some semblance of control, hours later, the yard lay battered and blackened, key equipment ruined, the repair schedule for weeks thrown into disarray. Several workers, Danish and German, lay dead or badly injured. The hospital in town overflowed its wartime budget of beds. In Berlin, the news traveled quickly, its implications clear even to those who only saw the war in terms of arrows on maps and numbers in columns. Ships slated to return to the sea would instead sit, half-repaired, in charred docks. Reprisals followed, as they always did. The Gestapo swooped down with the vicious efficiency that was both their hallmark and their curse. Houses near the harbor were searched, doors kicked down in the small hours, men dragged into the cold for questioning. Lists were drawn up based on grudges, rumors, misunderstandings. A few unlucky souls, who had nothing to do with the resistance beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong time, disappeared into prisons and camps whose names would only later become shorthand for horror. The fishermen, for once, were not spared suspicion. Restrictions tightened like a constrictor's coils. New rules dictated when boats could leave and return, how much fuel they could carry, how often they could visit the shipyard's fish dock. German naval patrols prowled the approaches more aggressively, their searchlights stabbing at the night. Dogs sniffed at crates, and bayonets prodded nets. For the resistance, the sea, which had been a road, became also a risk. Every sortie now had to slip through narrower gaps of complacency and fatigue. The boats could no longer come and go quite so freely, yet the very breadth of the fishing fleet, the sheer number of vessels and men who depended on them, made total control impossible. The Germans could plug some holes in their net, but not all. The campaign of sabotage from the boats did not end after that great fire. It changed. It became more cautious, more opportunistic, focusing on smaller but still meaningful targets. A barge carrying ammunition here, a warehouse storing spare parts there. The big, spectacular blows were no longer possible without intolerable risk. But the fishermen had already achieved what London had hoped for. The yard's capacity was battered at a critical time. Ships were delayed. Convoy schedules shifted. Somewhere, beyond the horizon of any Danish villager, sailors on Arctic convoys found a gap in the wolf pack's teeth, and something else had changed too. Something less tangible, but just as real. The myth of Danish passivity had been irrevocably damaged. The shipyard workers, who had watched their place of toil burn, whispered among themselves about who could have done such a thing, and why. Some, embittered by German brutality, found their sympathies shifting. Others, out of fear, informed. A few of those informers did not live very long afterward, but the idea that ordinary men with ordinary tools could strike at the occupier where he felt strongest had taken root. For Otto Brandt, the events of that night carved a deep, jagged line through his perception of the war. In his later reports, stamped and countersigned, he never again used the phrase harmless fisherman. The fishing fleet became, in his vocabulary, a potential vector of enemy activity. He ordered more motor launches, more random searches, more paperwork. In private, rubbing the bridge of his nose as fatigue settled into his bones, he thought of the silhouettes on the water and wondered how many eyes had watched his yard from the dark. He did not. could not know their names: Eric, Karl, Soren, Johann. He did not know that Johann would die months later, not in a blaze of glory, but in a ditch, shot during a botched arrest. He did not know that Anna would one day, years after the war, stand in a quieter harbor and watch her children run along a pier that no longer echoed with German boots. He did not know that in London, a clerk would file a thin folder under Danish naval sabotage operations, fishing fleet, and that the details would gather dust for decades before a historian dug them out again. History, as written in books and taught in classrooms, would remember larger operations more clearly: the rescue of Danish Jews across the Øresund in fishing boats, the nationwide strikes, the political maneuvers. Those, rightfully, would take their place in the tapestry of the war. The nights when small boats carried silent packages to the edges of shipyards, the careful minutes when a man's hand lingered on a crate just long enough, all that would slide toward obscurity, recorded in flickering memories and fading ink. But for the men who had held the wheel in those dark hours, for the women who had lied with a steady gaze when questioned, for the children who had gone to sleep smelling smoke and salt, the war would always have this additional chapter. It would be the memory of engines muttering softly under starless skies, of the feel of a timer's cold metal case in a wool-gloved hand, of the sight of an enemy's lights winking out one by one as fire rose to take their place. In the end, that was the real lesson of Denmark 1943, the one that no official report from the occupiers could ever fully admit. It was not simply that shipyards could burn, that logistics could be disrupted, that even in a quiet country the war had sharp teeth. It was that power, when it looks only at what it considers big and important, at tanks, at warships, at grand strategies, blinds itself to the small and the ordinary. It is in that blindness that resistance finds its opening. Out on the water, long after the last fires had been doused and rebuilt, cranes again traced their skinny arms against the sky. Fishing boats continued to move with the tides, their paint peeled, their engines coughed, their nets snagged on rocks. To a casual observer, they were nothing but working craft, part of the background hum of coastal life. But in their timbers, in the stories told in low voices over coils of rope and mugs of coffee, there lingered the memory of nights when they had been more than that. They had been weapons no one had expected. They had been the road no one had thought to guard. And somewhere, in an office far from the smell of tar and brine, a former naval officer would still, years later, startle slightly at the sound of a fishing boat's engine in the distance, and remember how one night, in a misty Danish harbor, his shipyards awoke in flames.